Welcome to another episode of Twice Told Tales podcast. Today we have Vanessa Beeley back to our show. She is an independent investigative journalist based in Syria. She has just returned from her trip to Iran, and we're going to hear more about what is happening in Syria and her observations about Iran. Vanessa, welcome back to the show.
Hi guys, thank you so much for inviting me back on.
It's a pleasure to have you. So
a lot has happened since we've talked to you a month ago.
Yeah. I don't know. I came back on the 30th of January, and literally only a week back in Damascus before the earthquake hit, and Syria, which is already suffering incredible torture, basically, under Western sanctions that have been increased through every US administration, whether it's Republican or Democrat, doesn't make a difference. In fact, the Republican administration probably tightened the economic screws more than the Democrats. So, this entire claim that Trump was anti-war and so on, maybe he was anti-military war, but as regards Syria, the economic war increased under his administration. And now we have actually freezing temperatures here, snow, ice, rain. Literally, the day of the earthquake, the weather suddenly took a turn for the worse, and we had, this morning it was just sheet ice everywhere. And so in these conditions, people are on the streets having their houses collapsed. Houses, of course, that have just survived also 11 years of war, of terrorists tunneling under those houses, because a lot of people said to me, but how could those houses just collapse like that? And I said, well, much of these areas were occupied by the terrorist groups, backed by the West, of course. And those groups effectively built entire cities under the city. Any city that they occupied, tunnels were built, and they weren't just unprofessional tunnels. We were talking about this the other day. They were entire catacombs, entire cities. They had hospitals underground. They had ammunition dumps underground. They had weapons underground. They could drive cars through some of these tunnels.
Wow.
And this was expertise that was actually given to the Muslim Brotherhood groups by Hezbollah. So this was the use of expertise and strategy from the resistance axis that was then used, weaponized against the resistance axis in Syria.
Is there any evidence of like U.S. machinery going over there to dig tunnels? Because I know there's a strong tie between the Boring Company and the U.S. government. That's Elon Musk's the company for digging tunnels. And I'm always curious whether Musk was involved in that operation, because he seems like the kind of guy.
This is the interesting thing, or I don't know if interesting is the right word, the tragic thing to some degree about the earthquake is that literally across the line into Idlib, where the terrorist groups are in control, dominated, of course, by Al-Qaeda, but their auxiliary, which is the White Helmets, created by UK military intelligence and US aid, established in Turkey and Jordan, not inside Syria. They basically, since 2013, and their entire YouTube, they have an entire YouTube channel dedicated to the receipt of bulldozers and heavy digging equipment and unbelievable modern sophisticated equipment that is just not in existence in Syria. To give you an idea, the budget for the White Helmets per year is 35 million. the budget for the real Syria civil defense, which was established in 1953, it's the only recognized civil defense organization by Geneva, the International Civil Defense Organization in Geneva. Their budget is $50,000.
Wow. For the whole country of Syria.
Yeah, for the whole country of
Wow.
Syria. So they're doing, emergency relief work with vehicles that the majority of them were kind of built pre-1980 and for which they have no spare parts because the majority of vehicles came in from Europe, particularly from Germany, like Mercedes and so on. And they haven't been able to get spare parts for those vehicles since 2011. Meantime, of course, the White Helmets and Al-Qaeda are not under sanctions, and they've been receiving, as I said, an incredible amount of sophisticated equipment. And this is another argument that I keep giving to people is if the White Helmets are neutral and impartial, why, during a tragedy that is affecting all Syrians, why are you not sending this equipment into Aleppo, into the areas that are under the protection of the government? They're not.
Wow.
True. Yeah.
Well, how did you experience the earthquake in Damascus? Like how strong did it wake you up? Did you feel it?
Well, actually, funny enough, I mean, where I am, we didn't feel a thing. We're in a little kind of suburb to the west, to the quite far west of Damascus, in the countryside, actually. But friends of mine, only 5 kilometers away, definitely felt it in a relatively high-rise building. Friends of mine in central Damascus felt it for sure, and in Jordan and Lebanon. I mean, Lebanon, there was a surveillance TV camera footage that was published. I published it as well on my Telegram, showing the quake lasting minutes. I mean, it wasn't, it went on for a long time, and the aftershocks are still continuing even today. Or there are smaller quakes still going on around 5 on the Richter scale that are being reported on the same fault line as this one.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking, I'm always thinking, let's say I'm just a general skeptic of everything. So, and I know that the Israeli government is very keen to destroy the region that was affected by much of this earthquake. And so I was thinking, would it be possible that this was a human-made earthquake, or at least a human-triggered earthquake? Because fault lines are always there's always a little bit of tension, and if you can release that tension, you can get an earthquake. And I was reading that they stopped the underground nuclear testing out west in the U.S. because they were triggering 5+ earthquakes that were 5+ on the Richter scale with 150 kiloton explosions, underground nuclear explosions. So that was back in I think that last tests were in the early 60s in the U.S. And so underground tests, because they had to cancel them because they were causing these earthquakes. So I don't know. With all that underground tunnel digging equipment, and they had huge, they had a period of time now where they just sitting idle with digging equipment. It just seems plausible to me that they just dug a really deep tunnel and put a huge explosion down there.
I mean, there are also, I always keep an open mind to this kind of thing, and there is the fact that the Erdogan regime were apparently or seemingly being very critical of the US just before the earthquake hit. And obviously there had been the recent rapprochement between Turkey and Syria, that is really going to be a big turnaround for Syria if it goes ahead. So with Israel bombing humanitarian aid convoys that were coming in from Iran through Iraq and into Syria, for example, bombing Damascus airport, there were a number of incidents that demonstrated that the US and Israel were really not happy about a recent pivot by Turkey back towards Iran, Russia, and Syria. And yes, with the Turkish regime rhetoric very much anti-US for some time, actually. That's been not necessarily from Erdogan, but from members of the government. You'll remember after the terrorist attack in Istanbul, I can't remember which minister it was, but he basically told the US to keep out of their business and that they weren't going to accept condolences from them and so on. So, you know, there have been rumblings of anti-US sentiment from inside Turkey. And we know that the US doesn't tolerate that, particularly at this juncture in history, when they're effectively trying to control the world and the world resources.
Do you think that rapprochement would go as far as denying U.S. Fuel tankers from crossing the border, illegally stealing oil from Syria? Because the U.S. is currently stealing 80% of Syria's oil.
The idea is that Syria would have back control of its resources. So then, you know, Turkey is always to some degree in a win-win situation. Yeah. Because, like, for example, with Russia, it's playing the middleman, and so therefore it's the one that's receiving Russian gas and oil, and then it's trading it on to Europe. And it's been doing that, you know, it's been playing that role for some time, since pre-2011. So Turkey stands to gain really whatever the situation or whichever side comes up on top. Which you have to sort of take your hat off to Erdogan, much as I dislike, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood and what he's done to Syria. You have to kind of reluctantly admire how he has effectively played both ends against the middle without actually getting regime changed or assassinated in the process, although he's come close a couple of times.
Yeah.
That's true. What about this prediction or that went viral by, I think, a Dutch scholar? Do you think that is also some sign of, like, I don't know, maybe as Chris mentioned, that there is something there that was actually triggered by humans? Or
let me just summarize what that was. There was a geologist who has a YouTube channel who talks about earthquakes and things, and he had said that there was likely going to be an earthquake. And I think you can do that based on I've studied geology, and I think you can do that basically by monitoring the tremors that are happening in the various fault lines.
Yeah, it's not a new thing.
Yeah. But if you were a government and you had geologists on staff, you could know that there is this tension buildup on that fault line, and you could have, a year or two advance. You could say, well, we know there's tension on that fault line. Let's target that with an explosion, and then you could cause a huge earthquake. So that would be my theory.
And I mean, there's also the fact that I think it was US and a number of other countries evacuated their embassy staff just prior to the earthquake. Now, if they knew there was a chance of an earthquake coming, you know, why didn't they make that knowledge public to the Turkish and to the Syrians? Who
that's the question.
Would be affected, you know? Yeah. So, there are a lot of there are a lot of questions. And I guess at some point, you know, people are going to start investigating and looking into it. Right now, of course, we're just dealing with a humanitarian disaster. I mean, more than 2,000 dead and God knows how many thousands still under the rubble, because, as I said, we simply don't have the equipment. You know, we have teams coming in from countries that are effectively defying the Caesar Act, because as you know, under the Trump administration, the Caesar Act effectively sanctions any country that comes to the assistance of Syria. So that can be Iran, it can be Russia. And that, you know, that's why when a lot of people say to me, well, why isn't China doing this? And why isn't Russia doing that? And why isn't Iran doing that? And, you know, I say to them, well, it's possible that they're doing what they're doing in private and they're not making it public, because if they make it public, they're going to get more sanctions brought down on them by the US, right? So there's a lot of that going on. I'm aware of that happening in Syria, that there is help coming in, but that countries are wary of being public over it. But what I'm sort of very heartened by is the number of countries that have defied the Caesar Act and are actually sending planes and rescue team and rescue equipment, humanitarian aid by plane to the various airports in Damascus and Aleppo, for example. Venezuela landed last night.
Yeah. Venezuela and who else?
Well, obviously Iran, Russia, Iraq has sent a convoy. I think it's promised a convoy of 28 fuel tankers if they make it across the border. And Algeria was one of the first. Armenia, of course. Venezuela, as I said, I spoke to the ambassador in Damascus yesterday, Jose Biamorgi, and he told me that the plane was landing last night with a team of 20, and they would go first to Latakia and then to Aleppo, but they were bringing in aid also. Egypt has promised aid. UAE has already sent aid. I think that's it. I'm not sure if Jordan has responded yet. Lebanon, of course, Hezbollah have sent in teams and aid. I think it was the security minister in Lebanon he sort of pointed out a loophole in the Caesar Act. And you know, they're all basically saying, look, you keep saying that humanitarian sectors are excluded from the unilateral sanctions. Of course they're not. But what they've done by pushing that point is, of course, they've given these countries a kind of loophole where they can say, yeah, but this is humanitarian aid, so it's excluded from the sanctions on Syria and the sanctions on countries that are coming to their aid. It's crazy.
In terms of these, all these countries coming together to help, it seems like that could inadvertently help bring more cohesiveness to the region. Like,
exactly.
Yeah,
that's a blessing in disguise.
Well, I think what it's doing is demonstrating again, but very clearly now, you know, there's a very clear line being drawn between the inhumanity of the West and its allies and the humanity of the resistance axis. You know, that what they're doing is putting humanity first. What the West is doing is putting their vindictive foreign policy first. Right. And you know, 24,000 Syrians can die as far as they're concerned. They've made that absolutely clear. And
in horrible ways.
The thing is,
not just being blown up, but in horrible ways, like starving and freezing to death in the cold. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You know, it doesn't matter how.
And then celebrating.
Yeah. And, you know, when they talk about, for example, humanitarian aid, they are sending humanitarian aid. No, they're not. They're sending so-called humanitarian aid to the section of the northwest of Syria in Idlib that is occupied and controlled by various armed groups dominated by Al-Qaeda. And in the north, it's coming into Afrin, which is controlled by the Turkish proxy armed groups. So it's not coming in Syria. It's not coming via the Syrian government. The legitimate, internationally recognized Syrian government is not receiving and distributing the aid. It's coming in through Turkey, which is a hostile state that has annexed Syrian territory. It's coming to groups that have effectively destroyed Syria for the last 11 years. And as I put out a video this afternoon, it's being stolen. It's being stolen and it's then being sold to Syrian civilians. So again, Syrian civilians are irrelevant in Western foreign policy. They don't care about Syrian civilians.
It's just an excuse to fund the moderate rebels covertly, basically. Like
and the white helmets, because you know the white helmet brand itself was severely damaged by, for example, the reports of their crimes against the Syrian people, which included organ trafficking, child abduction, participation in the armed group torture and execution of government loyalists, etc. Um, and then, of course, the fact that they were exposed to have staged the chemical weapon alleged event in Douma in 2018, which led to the unlawful aggression by the UK, US, and France against Syria without even the OPCW report having been started, without inspectors even having got into Douma. And so the entire brand, along with the OPCW credibility, had been severely injured, right? And then they tried to pump it up with sending the white helmets to Ukraine and you know, it's kind of tagging them onto the Ukraine narrative. That failed. And so now I have it from an inside source that Samantha Power at USAID has instructions now to basically re-promote and rebrand the white helmets. As I predicted today on Twitter, they will no doubt receive their 4th Nobel Prize nomination as a result.
Sure.
And basically you're seeing Western media wall-to-wall white helmets again. You know, it's extraordinary. It's just like some horrible propaganda Groundhog Day. It's just, it's unbelievable.
And they're so discredited, like with anyone who just knows how to read, like they're so discredited. Like if you just, like the only, that's really depressing. That's. I mean, they should at least change it to like the purple helmets or something. At least change something.
Oh no, they have the violets. They created the violets, which are kind of a branch off of the white helmets, which I wrote about actually.
I'm surprised it wasn't the pink helmets, to be honest.
No. Yeah, it's the violets.
Code Pink should take over that role. They're already doing a good enough job destroying things here.
Oh.
Well, so did you see Aaron Mate tweeted this really great thing that then Mint Press posted on their Instagram? That's how I saw it. He tweeted a series of tweets, but the one that was most significant to me was he retweeted a video. I forget which U.S. official it was who said, like, we're not going to contribute to reconstruction in Syria. It was after, you know, whatever U.S. funded bombing campaign or whatever. I forget which city it was, but they were like, we're not going to contribute. We're not, like, it's just so obvious that the U.S. just wants to sit there and watch civilians die.
The rest of Syria, though, is rubble. And what the Russians want and what Assad wants is economic reconstruction. And that is something that the United States can basically hold a card on via the international financial institutions and our cooperation with the Europeans. So we argue that absent behavioral changes by the Assad regime, we should hold the line on preventing reconstruction aid and technical expertise from going back into Syria.
And it's the same now. Even after an earthquake, the U.S. is not lifting a finger. So it's fascinating.
Mm. Yeah, but I mean, you know, I guess we shouldn't be surprised after 500,000 kids in Iraq, after Libya, after Yemen, Syria, Venezuela. I mean, basically anywhere the US is, the country is devastated, decimated, and destroyed, and the people are irrelevant. You know, when they all start complaining about, the drug trafficking and prostitution in Libya, well, hello.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, this is all generated by the U.S. cartel. And, you know, when I talk about the U.S., I guess I'm not even talking about successive administrations. I'm talking about the people behind the throne, you know, the billionaire complex that is effectively running the show, whether it's UK, US, EU, the entire Western hemisphere, basically. And then, of course, you know, I would put Australia and the Gulf states and Israel into the same basket. But it's the billionaire complex. It's the plutocracy behind that are effectively running the show. And no, of course we know from the COVID project that they don't care about human lives. You know, when elderly are left to die in care homes alone, and they're literally given enough tranquilizer to send them on their way, when Canada is introducing a medically assisted death program that is going to cleanse Canada of the homeless, the depressed, the suicidal, is now even targeting up to 1-year-old babies. You know, then you have to start understanding that the inhumanity that is on display right now has been visible for a long time. It's just a lot of people haven't picked up on it or haven't seen it. But, and I think as much as the earthquake in Syria is a tragedy, and it is absolutely devastating for the Syrian people. It's like the other day when it happened, I just thought, I don't think Syria could be any more broken than it is right now. And I really shouldn't say that because the US is capable of anything. But, the positive, if you have to start looking for positives that will come out of this, I think, is that people will hopefully be even more aware of the inhumanity of their regimes in the West, not only against Syria, but against them.
Yeah, and they have to be careful because that inhumanity doesn't, I think a lot of people just don't understand. They look at the history and they think, oh, I'm going to know when it's evil because it looks like that. That's what evil looks like. But they constantly find ways of selling this inhumanity to you in ways that make it look like it's benefiting society. And that's what Nazis did. Well, but we're not going to have the same history again. We're going to have different flavors. And this time it's like, oh, in Canada, oh, it's a human right. You should be able to die at any age, even if you're like, or whatever.
It's like they've just done in Iran, championing women's rights.
Exactly.
And I just spent the 2 weeks in Iran, which was kind of fascinating. But the fact that they've kind of pinpointed women's rights, which actually, what they've pinpointed, which is, of course, as Amnesty International describe it, the forced veiling, which is a total mischaracterization of Iran anyway. But
that's like saying forced drawing or forced shirt wearing of women in the West.
Well,
the same
it's
exact
not only
thing.
that, because veiling, but using the lexicon veiling automatically makes people think of either the chador or the burqa. True.
That's true.
Right?
That's not even the right word, like veil. That's
exactly. So, if they had said forced head covering, okay, then people would probably shrug and go, yeah, whatever, But the actual lexicon they use is so clever because automatically in people's brains, they're thinking at least hijab, but probably burqa or niqab, and they can't see anything. And they're, like you'd see in Afghanistan, of course, under the Taliban.
Wow.
So it's very clever how they do it. And the extraordinary thing, I mean, your article at Grey Zone was just perfect. And I was trying to explain in Iran, this is what you need to be doing. Like, you've got to be really so accurate in pinpointing the false information, the disinformation. Because when I started throwing that article back at the kind of tsunami of trolls that suddenly came onto my tweet, they had nowhere to go, right? Because anyone reading their tweet and then reading the article is like, okay, this looks familiar. But unless Iran as a whole, as its media complex, not the Saudi-funded or the Western-funded or the Israeli-funded entities that are pushing out the propaganda, but the actual Iranian media needs really to start understanding again, because this is this is a bit Groundhog Day, because this is exactly the problem in Syria as well, is that they didn't realize the power of the information war and the power of the information complex and how professional it is and how well resourced it is. This is very important. It's
like Press TV just avoided the whole topic basically, which was really kind of and I felt like frustrated because I'm not gonna back any side ideologically, but I just think in terms of self-defense, like, why didn't they do articles like we wrote? I mean, as far as I know, the article that we wrote is basically the only example of that on the internet. And
it is.
Well, I think the thing. Yeah. Well, I think it is like a part of it is because that a lot of people and officials inside Iran do not really understand the power of the information war and disinformation war that is against Iran. But it's also like personally for me, it is that there are just so many lies and so many examples of those things that it becomes just ridiculous, and you feel like as I said, like in the interview with Clayton Morris, that I did not feel it was so important to like to show that there are so many lies, because they looked very ridiculous, and I didn't believe that there are a lot of people that are actually believing those lies. And if it wasn't that I mentioned a few of them to Chris, and he actually told me that how it was important to address those lies, I probably wouldn't feel the impetus to actually do it. And there are, I mean, that the ones that we did is just maybe the tip of the iceberg. Like, every day I see a lot of those examples, and now I understand how important it is to exactly pinpoint those lies that are just being spread. And all of them, like CNN, BBC, influencers, like everyone is involved. A recent example of which was there was, I don't know if you had heard the story of this 20-something girl that was jailed during the protest, and CNN did a full report of with details how she had been raped and her head shaved and taken to hospital and everything. And yesterday or the day before yesterday, she was released with the same hair and with nails like this long.
This sounds very familiar, like the story about the kids in Dara at the beginning of the engineered protests in Syria. I mean, this is the thing for me. It's just a recycling of the playbook. You know, it's, as your friend Hannah said, it's boring. Actually,
exactly,
it's boring, but it's kind of deadly, because the West has not learned from history, unfortunately, and there is a sort of antipathy towards Iran because of what is perceived as an Islamic leadership. And, it's a bit like China, Iran, and even Russia have really been dehumanized for years in the West. This isn't something new, so it's relatively easy for them to throw in something that is emotively triggering for the West. And of course, as I pointed out, the Amnesty International lexicon, the forced veiling, and immediately people, when I was kind of showing videos of just walking on the streets in Tehran or in Shiraz or in Isfahan, and it's an absolute myriad of kind of beanie hats and scarves half up or scarves down, or people just wearing hoodies, or people wearing chador and hijab, and it's a mixture. And this is the biggest kind of point that I took away from the 2 weeks that I spent, is the diversity is just not being reported in the West. Of course it isn't, because it doesn't want to make the entire narrative complicated. It just needs to be, well, these are women's freedom activists fighting against the bad regime that is forcing them to dress in a certain way, and so on. And as you said, Chris, I'm not ideologically attached to this either. But my role is to identify what the West is doing to destabilize any country. And it's blatantly obvious. Iran is surrounded on almost every side by hostile or controlled states.
Yeah, and it's not like you're taking the side of the West because you hate the West. Like, all this stuff is bad for the West as well. Like, this, whatever this war blight that's taken over the Western politics since 9/11 is it's all driving the West into a pit of hell. Like, it may not seem like it, but that's what's happening, because the rest of the world sees this stuff, and that's why it's really disgusting when I see groups like Code Pink, who's a women's rights supposedly run organization, who says they're for peace, and gets these kind of absurd sort of like where they break into some sort of government conference and hang a banner up somehow. Somehow they get into these like secure meetings and make a big show of it and show it on how they're leading this like women's led and then they go along with the weaponization of women's rights to regime change Iran. They just go fully along with it. We stand with the women of Iran. And it's like, how are we supposed to take that seriously? And now they're ducking out of the biggest anti-war protest that America's seen in at least a decade. They're ducking out because one of the speakers said some questionable things about feminism. So it's like they don't even they go along with the weaponization of women's rights to overthrow Iran because it's just and now they're worried about their fundraising scheme because they basically fundraise from a bunch of boomer older women. That's where they get their money from, and so they're afraid of that, like, you know, some offensive male speaker. And this, we're dealing with World War III. Like, sorry, that was face.
No, but I mean it's entirely true, and I think what I also found kind of ironic was my understanding after the time that I spent in Iran is that a lot of the kind of power behind the protests is coming from the nouveau riche in Tehran, and when you go to those areas, the majority of them, although they're not wearing headscarf, they're wearing face masks. So I guess
the new religion,
I kind of
taking over Islam.
Yeah, no, but this is the most. This I just found supremely ironic was that I was just like, yeah, but hold on. So you're basically
forced veiling. That's forced veiling.
You're protesting publicly, and you're supporting violent protests, right, in Iran, because you object to the oppression of wearing a headscarf. And people need to understand wearing a headscarf means literally just pulling your scarf up and covering your hair. Most people have the majority of their hair showing. Okay. As I said, ideologically, I'm not defending anything, but I'm just pointing out the facts on the ground, which are not being reported by the BBC and BBC Farsi and CNN and Amnesty International, etc. But yeah, when you go into these areas, many of them are wearing masks. And I think, well, okay, so you're rejecting what you perceive as an oppressive symbol of an oppressive regime in your own country. I'm using their kind of linguistics now. But but everything in the West is kind of okay in your view, and yet you're wearing what is a symbol of oppression that was introduced by the West against its own populations and globally, right? Yep. This, you know, and I remember at the beginning of the COVID project in 2020, a Yemeni friend of mine actually, I mean, he was kind of joking, but he said, you know, it's quite funny. Like the West has been against, they've legislated against wearing the burqa, and here they are, they're literally wearing the burqa in public.
Yeah, well, that was France. That was the most amazing thing.
Especially in France, yes.
Yeah, France was great because they like a year before outlawed, you know, burqa for security reasons because they couldn't identify you.
Exactly.
And then a year or two later, they're mandating everyone cover their full face. And it's because this is like a new religion, this COVIDian stuff. And this underscores what I was talking about, the Iran situation. It's a culture war. They're weaponizing a difference in culture because in the West, we do something different. And it tends to be that the upper class in Iran, because they have more free time and they can travel more, they integrate some of this Western culture into their own worldview. And so that shows how the COVID hysteria was influenced them even more because they got not only the Iranian COVID hysteria, but they got injected with the more toxic Western COVID hysteria in the English language media. But then just in general, like embracing Western culture means looking like Westerners. And I found this really fascinating. There was, I forget the name of the guy, Mazda something. He did this podcast with the Covert Action Quarterlies podcast, which is a really good podcast, by the way. He mentioned that early on, like in the 1930s in Iran, there actually was this campaign to remove the burqa. That was the campaign to have not the burqa, the hijab and the traditional dress of everyone.
Hijab.
Yeah, hijab. It was like a war against the hijab. And could you talk about that, Setareh? Because that's something that people don't get in the West.
Yeah, so during the first Pahlavi, he was trying to modernize Iran, and that he started by changing the dress codes. So he banned any form of hijab, and there was also a form of hat that men had to wear, which was similar to what in France in Europe people would wear. So that's like the society looked more modern. So and a lot of people had to, like a lot of women had to choose to stay at homes and not socialize or not come out because they didn't want to remove their hijab. And a lot of people also immigrated to the neighboring countries like Kuwait or Iraq or other countries where they could practice the hijab, but there was popular resistance against that, and they had to abolish it at some point.
So
but it was a very forceful way, a very...
Go ahead.
It wasn't what?
I said this is not the first time where forces have tried to tell Iranian women what they should or shouldn't do. Like this happened before. And it was forceful, more forceful. Yeah. That's what you were saying. Okay.
And the attacks actually now on women wearing the chador, for example, are escalating, as far as I understand from people that I talk to. But also, I visited, I think it was on the last day, it was, the prison of the Shah Pahlavi in Tehran, and I can't remember the name of the prison, Setareh, if you can remember it. You must know it, I think, where they effectively, CIA and Mossad trained torturers and all the various torture techniques, such as waterboarding, electric shock, putting them in an iron cage. I think so, yeah, in the center of Tehran.
Yeah, Savak was Savak was the intelligence service of the Pahlavi, which was trained by Mossad, and they had several prisons, and the way they tortured people was like really barbaric.
Yeah. And I actually interviewed a former prisoner there who talked, and the fact that the prisons were overcrowded, women were being tortured by men. I mean, there were not women torturers. They were effectively being humiliated and raped and tortured by men. And, and I actually asked him, I said, well, how do you feel about these protesters that are talking about bringing back the son of the Shah? And he said, for me, this is just, it's horrific after what I went through. But, what he basically said is that there has been a lack of attention to educating young people in the history of particularly the revolution. I mean, the revolution was 1979. So for this generation, it's kind of, the reasons for the revolution and why it happened and so on have faded with Western influence and money, as you said. The fact that it's a lot of the propulsion for the campaigns is coming from the nouveau riche in Tehran, which is sort of an inversion of what happened in Syria, because as we talked about before, it was the rural areas that were pushed into the poor suburban areas and then were easily radicalized and turned against the government. But in Tehran, it's coming from, in a sense, the wealthy, privileged, educated class. And
that's
it's for me, it's kind of, that's very interesting. But what I was pleased about was that I was literally allowed to interview anyone, even those who were, when I say allowed, because I was working on a documentary with Press TV, for which people, of course, are going to tell me I'm just a regime puppet, etc. But actually, I mean, they
Yeah.
allowed me to really be quite instructive over the documentary and to see it as
That's
me
great.
being a neutral observer and being able to speak to, you know, every sector of society. So we did end up interviewing girls who, one, she's actually leaving Iran. But what came across, and I guess these were all genuine people. These are not kind of, you know, the Saudi, Western, Israeli funded agent provocateurs or Twitter trolls or MEK affiliates or ISIS affiliates or Kurdistani separatists, etc., etc. These were genuine patriots, but who had, you know, genuine concerns about the society they're living in, but were prepared to talk about it. And I think this is what I'm trying to say is the power of women in Iran is being completely eradicated by Western narratives. You know, women in Iran are being portrayed as these helpless creatures that can't change or transform their own destiny. And it's so criminal. You know, I didn't speak to one woman that didn't have a clear idea of exactly what they wanted in society in Iran, and had a very clear vision of how to achieve it. Right? Whether, you know, and I'm not talking about protesters, I'm just talking about student union, entrepreneurs, business class, political class, student class, etc. You know, and not one of them was remotely helpless.
Well, that's why when Code Pink, you know, who's traveled there and met with the same people you did, or the same types of people in same organizations, does what they did and just blindly backs the "we stand with the women of Iran" narrative is insane, and it really goes to show that there may not be a genuine desire for peace from the leadership of organizations like that. It may be a way of like controlling a large portion of, you know, of a radical peace movement that you can gear towards Iran. And I think Iran, getting a war started with Iran is challenging in the US. So you have to have multiple organizations that work long games, like, you know, decades of manipulating the public so that you can nudge them into supporting a campaign like that. Even if they don't support the bombing, they have this guy Zunis who advises them, who's a supposed professor or something. And he went, you know, he was the same in Syria. He would be like, "Oh, I don't support regime change, but Assad is a butcher," or whatever. I mean, obviously he didn't say that. And if you ever said that to him, he would come back with a 20-page email saying how he didn't say that. But he says that that's his theme is like, he agrees with the U.S. foreign policy, but doesn't agree with the bombing. So you fill that gap between the actual like anti-war and the regime. You fill that gap by saying, "Well, I don't support the war, but I support the narrative to get us to war." And that's what Code Pink did in this case. And I'm sure, and I know it was in part because of Zunis's, and you know, he's been pointed out to
Zunis, as you know, he's a Zionist basically. And he promoted, along with Richard Falk, Noam Chomsky, Finkelstein, all were pushing regime change, either directly or indirectly, in Syria. And they haven't changed, as far as I know. So
and
again,
it's
as I said, you know,
Code Pink looks to them for advice.
Yeah.
As a piece.
Yeah.
And
I personally find it very.
Yeah,
go ahead.
They protect him from criticism because I criticized him and his position on Iran in a group that I was a member of, because I traveled to Iran with Code Pink in a peace delegation, and they you know, they booted me from the group for telling them that you know, that what they were reading about Iran wasn't what it likely was, and that they should be concerned about people like Setareh who are getting death threats for reporting the truth on the ground. And they all knew Setareh because they met her there, and they dismissed her death threats, and then they booted me from the group. So because Stephen Zunis took issue with it.
Yeah.
What were you going to say, Setareh?
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say I personally find it very insulting because it's like because I'm a woman living in Iran and they're telling me like you don't know what is good for you and we know what is good for you, so we have to like you have to do it the way we are saying. It's exactly how it sounds. Like they don't care what the majority of women in Iran want or are pursuing. And I have I mean, yes, they sound to be anti-sanction or anti-war, but when it comes to women's cause inside Iran, it looks to me that they have this idea that there is like one form of practicing women's right, and that it's the way the West does it, and not, for example, the way Muslim women in Iran or elsewhere want to do it. So it's taking the agency and power away from Iranian women, and that's really
yeah,
yeah,
exactly. You know, which is what they always do. And I mean, another thing, and maybe Setareh, you can confirm this. What the majority of the women I interviewed said to me is, look, you know, the hijab is not the major issue. We have other issues that are simply not being addressed by the West, that we have been fighting for some time, and we will continue fighting for. The hijab is really, it's a symbolic thing, but it's minor in relation to what else we are actually trying to achieve. But of course, what happens when the West blows up or amplifies one aspect of the narrative, what happens then, any government is going to become almost more hardline because it's fighting back against Western influence in its country, right? So again, from that perspective, also they're retarding or they're sort of devolving, if that's a word, the progress of women's rights in Iran deliberately.
exactly.
They know what they're doing, you know, and
yeah, exactly.
The main,
that's what I have always.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry I talked over you. It's because of the internet connection,
No,
probably.
I know.
But yeah, it's yeah, yeah. It's because it makes our struggle a lot more difficult because like if the months or a day after the protest, I wanted to start a women's movement to work on other areas that I think are a lot more important and are affecting a lot more women inside Iran. The government is going to be suspicious and think that this is like I'm being supported from outside, and I understand this because the other women's movements ended up being infiltrated or set up by forces outside. So it's, I mean, if they were really genuine in like supporting women, the first thing that they would do would be to lift the sanctions and allow Iranian women to like travel more freely, because like it's not my government that does not allow me to travel outside Iran. It's the European and I don't know American government that does not like, for example, grant me a visa if I wanted to attend a conference, academic conference somewhere. They're making it very, very difficult for us. So it's very, very, very hypocritical. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what, even from men and women, I guess the biggest issue for the majority of people, or from, you know, the kind of 10, 15 interviews I was doing per day, and of course, the economy is being affected. I'm not saying it's not also being potentially mismanaged, because, you know, my philosophy is most governments mismanage most things at any given moment. So I'm not particularly surprised by that.
Yeah, that's
you know,
true.
even in the West, for God's sake, you know, we're not great. And all our economies in the West are in total free fall. So I don't think we have a leg to stand on from that perspective. But of course, what is adversely affecting the economy, and has been for some time, are the sanctions. And of course, that just isn't, you know, that isn't talked about in Western media. It's what I seem to pick up on, and again, it would be really interesting if you confirm it, is the West is influencing this sector also by effectively manipulating people into thinking Iran is poor, into thinking Iran is badly off, into thinking Iran is underdeveloped. And I gave one interview to a bunch of students in Tehran, and at the end of it, I just got a bit passionate about it, because I said, and by the way, the economy. I said, I've visited the poorest areas of Tehran and gone into people's homes where they have running hot water, where they have electricity, where they have heating, they have gas heating, like mains gas heating.
Yeah.
They have security cameras. I said, I'm sorry, but come to Syria if you really want to understand what economic hardship is. Iran has, it's one of the richest countries in resources. It's unbelievable. It's so vast, and you have such an environmental abundance in Iran, and then you have the resources. You have gas, you have oil, you gold. Of course, this is also one of the reasons that it's in the crosshairs of the entire kind of oligarch complex, right? Because I guess their ultimate plan is to control world resources, and Iran is very, very wealthy from that perspective. But yeah, a lot of them, when I actually started saying to them, well, what about this and what about that, they kind of were like, yeah, but we're just badly off. Compare us to I don't know, Europe or the US or the UK. I said, are you kidding me?
Exactly.
Like, you're paying 5 cents a liter for fuel. Ask any American or any European or any British person what they're paying for octane fuel for their car, and they'll die if you tell them 5 cents a liter. 5 cents a liter.
Yeah,
it's like
the other
300
day,
times
like
that.
after, well, they always want to compare themselves or compare Iran. They would, the argument that they would have, or argument, is that, well, you at UAE, or you can look at Qatar, or like European countries. But there's a lot of things that they. I think with all the economic grievances and problems, like serious problems, especially over the last maybe couple of years that we have had, we're still doing a lot better than a lot of other countries, like probably most countries. And it's also the prices. Like after we met, I had to do an X-ray, like see an orthopedist and do an X-ray, and the whole thing, like on my weekends, I booked an appointment online, and the whole thing, like seeing my doctor and getting an X-ray and going back to him, didn't took me more than 40 minutes. And I paid less than $8 for the whole thing without any insurance coverage, like because I'm self-employed and I didn't have any insurance, and there were people there who were like doing the X-ray or visiting the doctor for free because their insurance covered everything. So where in the world, like how many countries can you do all those things with less than $8?
Also the appointment time is really like my parents have like because they're old enough that in America, if you get to a certain age, they grant you healthcare, which is kind of ridiculous. So like when you're actually, anyway, so they have good health insurance, but it still takes them like weeks to get an appointment to go see something like that. So like, or you have to go to the emergency.
The UK and Europe is, they've just decimated the health service in the UK. It's appalling. It was appalling before I left the UK 20 years ago. And it's just gradually been eroded and hollowed out. Even France now is starting, and they were the flagship health service in Europe, basically. And even that is starting to fail now, to fail the population, despite the very high costs of medical insurance, or what they call I guess it's kind of social security insurance there. So, yeah, and even driving on the roads, going from Tehran to Isfahan and then to Shiraz. The roads are like 100 times better than the majority of European roads, not France, because they're renowned for having good roads. But at the UK, it's like 100 times better than the quality of roads in the UK. All these little things that you pick up on when you're there. Yeah, I think my biggest concern is there was an element of this kind of, it's not going to happen in Iran. You know, what happened in Syria is not going to happen in Iran. And I just hope they realize the enormity of the threat that they're facing and that they don't end up. I wouldn't want any country in the world to end up like Syria or Iraq or Libya or any of these countries that have effectively been, but particularly Syria, because if they're going to wage a war in Iran, it will be a proxy war. And that's exactly, of course, what they did in Syria. And I saw signs of very similar tactics, of course, in Iran.
But I think they seed that feeling that it's not going to happen there. That's part of the propaganda narrative, because they did that in Ukraine with the Ukraine situation too. They fed that heavily into the U.S. population so that people didn't resist it. So it's part of this way of reducing the resistance to the narrative. And I know they did that in Syria.
Yeah, it's not coming from. No, I mean from within Iran. There's an element.
Yeah, but I think it's all fed through BBC Persia and all that. It's part of this pre-war planning to get people to convince that it's not going to happen. This is just a, and so.
Well, like
I think it's because you don't really. Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah, I think the like Persian-speaking propaganda channels are playing a role by, for example, saying like that. No, we're not at the risk of like balkanization of Iran or Iran being torn apart into pieces and everything. But I don't think that's the main force that makes them. I think it's because a lot of people do not really understand. I mean, what exactly happened in Syria?
Yes. Exactly.
I still see a lot of people ignorance about what happened in Syria.
Definitely. And I think one of the most interesting interviews I had was with a guy in Shiraz. I kind of lost track of where I was and who I was interviewing. But he was a head of various student unions, very kind of eloquent, very well-informed guy. But his arguments were quite extraordinary. And I was talking to people afterwards and they said, yeah, this is very typical of the people that are kind of pivoting towards the West or are being heavily influenced, and particularly on the left in Iran. Again, if you can confirm this. But for example, many of his arguments were that it's time the Cold War ended. It's time Iran normalized relations with Israel, with America, and so on. And then he put forward the examples of China and Russia as countries that had normalized relations with the United States and had benefited from it. And I mean, I was interviewing him on camera, so my jaw couldn't literally drop on camera. So I just kind of kept a very, passive face. I thought, okay, I can see where this conversation is heading. And, and the funny thing was when I went back at him with various arguments, and particularly on China, I mean, I pointed out Xinjiang, the destabilization, the weaponization of the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, the encirclement of Taiwan, the naval buildup in the China Sea. So I said, if that's normalization of relations with the states, it doesn't exactly protect you or your national interests from interference by the US, either military, economic, or political, right? He conceded that. And then I think his final point was that there are countries that have made a success of normalization of relations, and he cited Turkey and Saudi Arabia. So I was like, well, yeah, of course, because if you're going to sponsor terrorism for the United States,
I was going to say,
you're going to have...
Wow.
But this I was told afterwards that this is very... it's a good example of the arguments used by the left, basically, against the government and against the leadership of Iran. It's very much this kind of let's normalize with everyone because that will resolve our economic problems, that will resolve our isolation, that will modernize our society, etc., etc. And why are we continuing this? And a lot of it, as you said, is actually this ignorance of what really happened, not only in Syria, but really in the region.
But in the region.
Yeah, because there's this perception, why are we helping Syria? You know, it's a poor country. And I said, well, hold on, it wasn't a poor country. It's basically the gateway to Eurasia. That's why it was targeted by the West for control of resources, but also control of the landmass itself, right?
Well, it's also poor when you steal 80% of the wealth of a country. Like, I mean, the U.S. is currently occupying 1/3 of the country illegally and stealing 80% of the oil. So if someone comes into your house, occupies 1/3 of it, and then steals 80% of your bank account or your salary, I think you would probably become poor no matter. I mean,
well, yeah, exactly, and yeah, it was. I think that was probably one of the most shocking elements was kind of the lack of awareness of what's really going
especially
on.
The new generation.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very sad. I mean, it's mostly with the new generation, but it's not limited to the new generation. Like, I see older people, like people older than me, who have actually seen what happened, like what the Pahlavi did and where Iran stood during the Pahlavi, saying that maybe they wish the Pahlavi to be back or that they don't want this government. And when I ask them about, like, well, okay, let's say that you hate the Islamic Republic, but do you really remember what it was like during those days? And I can't imagine how people have forgotten. Like, it's documented and everyone knows about like all the tortures and lack of freedom, the poverty, like the poverty that existed, or
and also
the corruption, the literacy.
You know, the British control of all your resources, basically. I mean,
what do you think causes that?
Yeah, exactly.
That ignorance. How can someone be that ignorant? Willingly ignorant.
I think when they're comfortable.
I don't know what exactly it is.
Right. For me, it's like in Syria, I was talking to a few Syrian friends when I came back and sort of comparing notes. And they said, well, pre-2011, everyone was relatively comfortable. So no one was really worried about anything. No one was really paying any attention to anything that was going on in the world. They were just kind of living their life. And yeah, you know, they all had a few complaints about the government. And yes, there was corruption. And yes, there was things going on. But nobody really cared because they had everything they needed. They had good salaries. They had cheap food. They had resources. They had electricity. You know, just like Iran now, really. They were very comfortable.
That's a good point.
So I think that makes people less. I mean, Syria changed very fast. You know, you can't go anywhere now in Syria. Well, now, but even before in 2015, 2016, when I was here, you could speak to a street sweeper and they would they would give you the history of the region. You know.
Wow.
But I think I think it's this sort of comfort zone.
They don't feel like they're challenged on any terms. Yeah.
Because I feel like what you're describing there is also happening in the West, especially among a lot of Western commentators. Like there's like this kind of false kind of equivalency being perpetuated by the media, and then especially new media, maybe the seemingly alternative media. Could you comment about that? What you've noticed there?
Yeah, I mean, there is this kind of wave of what I call the purist, privileged anti-war groups within independent media that are sort of issuing these very kind of esoteric statements of being against war, any war, and you know, Russia is basically equivalent to the West. Syria is obviously equivalent to the West because Syria is waging a war, you know, and it's such a reductionist argument, because it infers that the rest of us that are effectively taking a side, we're taking the side of the resistance against U.S. allied hegemony and military and economic supremacy, right? So we are taking a side. I'm perfectly happy to say that. But somehow, by doing that, it is inferred, although it's not directly said to any of us, that we are supporting war, which is the most, I mean, it's the most insane conclusion, because no one in their right mind supports war unless you're, Lockheed Martin or BAE or one of the military industrial complex that is benefiting from war. Nobody in their right mind supports war. But of course, we all support the sovereign right of any nation to defend itself against aggression and unlawful force, right?
Right.
So,
what's the
in
same?
other words, what they're doing is they're almost treating the symptoms and not the cause, which is something that we've done as the collective left for years. When we champion the refugee cause, we don't go to the heart of the matter, which again is neocolonialism that is destroying the country that the refugees are coming from.
But it's more superficial. I think it's a more recent sort of attack on anti-imperialist narratives. Like you see it, for example, in the defund the police narrative, that narrative where it's like, okay, so you just want to end all policing? Like, I mean, this is like a way of distracting, using leftist like sort of values and then shaping it in a way where it can come back and attack itself. Like that's what you do, because like, I mean, because it's an absurdity, and it's like doing that with pure, like requiring some sort of purity test before you can unite against anti-imperialist measures, or saying that all violence. It's just like the idea of who was it that was it Gandhi who talked about like the rapist, the woman being raped in the park and her defending herself as not violence. Like you can resist your attacker, and that's not violence. It may be forceful, it may be bloody, but it's not violence because you're protecting yourself. And so, like, to equate all warfare as oppressive warfare instead of defensive, or offensive instead of defensive, is it's really, that's perverse. That's
and it's I mean, I always say it's very privileged. Because if you've not faced a military invasion of your country and literally the rape and pillage of your country, and you haven't faced a situation where you're having to defend not only your country, but your family, your children, your grandparents, your parents, your neighbors against rape and ethnic cleansing and so on, then I don't know, you kind of, I would withhold judgment because
totally. That's what I would have told Coach Pink to do. Just not even speak on it. Like just
our focus should always be on Western hegemony, Western intervention, Western supremacy, Western neocolonialism, and that's it. As I said, in Iran, there are things that personally I found difficult. Who cares? That's not my position.
Not your home. You don't talk about. You don't need to tell other people how to do their home.
Our job is just to convey the voices that are basically being silenced by Western media, and to give them the space to talk and to actually explain in their words what is going on in their country. We shouldn't be kind of front of house. That's the whole point. We shouldn't be Code Pink kind of virtue signaling in Congress or wherever. But as you've said, what have they kind of really achieved? The wars have stopped.
Peace activists to boycott a peace protest. That's what they've achieved. So you got to question what's that about? Are they?
Yeah, I don't know. I have severe reservations about an awful lot of these organizations.
Yeah.
And I just think that my role and the role of any independent analyst, journalist, commentator, whatever, is to, and that's one reason why I like Clayton Morris, because he just allows you to speak. He's not imposing
That's true.
any ideology or any direction on what you're saying. He's interceding with some commentary himself, but he basically gives you a platform to present your case. And that's what we should really be doing as journalists. Whatever our bias, because we all do have bias. I mean, mine is anti-imperialist, as is yours. But I'm also anti-war. To even sort of indicate that I might be pro-war is just insane for me. Nobody is. Nobody. You think any Syrian is pro-war?
I mean, and if you look at just what Russia did in Ukraine, and you actually analyze it over the last 15 years, you can see that Russia itself was doing this as a way of preventing further escalation, which is, so it's
and I saw someone actually say, well, why didn't they do anything earlier, like after 2014, when the ethnic cleansing was going on, blah blah blah. I was like, oh, right. So who was supplying the weapons to the defense, the defense militia in Donetsk and Luhansk and so on? I mean, the thing is that most of these people don't have any idea of how Russia operates. It's like when people in Syria sort of say, well, why didn't Russia shoot down the Israeli missiles? Well, hold on. One, this is Syrian sovereignty. So it's Syrian air defense, which, by the way, is maintained and looked after by Russians as well as Syrians. But Syria is very proud of its air defense. So it's Syria that is responsible for the air defense, right, inside Syria.
Probably coming from people who are from a culture which has apparently accepted the fact that you can just go bomb generals in other countries and assassinate, like Soleimani in Iraq. An Iranian general assassinated in Iraq with a U.S. or what is it, Israeli? It doesn't matter. It's that's a cultural thing here where people just accepted it. They're like, all right, I guess that's what we're doing now. So it's not surprising that they wouldn't be like, well, why isn't Russia just shooting things willy-nilly? Because some states actually have maintained
and that's how far we've drifted from international law, right? From global security. That's how far we've drifted from it, where people are actually, while claiming to be anti-war, they're literally projecting a kind of video game version of war without any consequences.
It's unbelievable.
It is. It's kind of mind-blowing.
How do you maintain your sanity and your optimism for the future?
Dogs.
Yeah.
Oh.
I was on Instagram.
Animals.
I was on Instagram the other day, looking at different accounts because I'm managing some of that, and I saw your account on there. And I saw the last post you had was with a pink VW Beetle in Damascus from 2020. That's pretty awesome.
No, that's
and you have some beautiful horses.
The BBC put on the front page of their website. They actually doxed me with that car because there's a picture of President Assad and Hafez al-Assad in the back window.
Oh, really?
Which they objected to.
Oh, nice.
I thought was kind of funny. So that was all over Twitter for quite a long time. And it still pops up on Twitter every now and then that Bellingcat decide they want to sort of have a dig at me. They post the picture of the pink car, and I'm like, oh, I love that car.
Is it your car, or did you just get a chance to drive it around?
Well, no, it actually belongs to a friend of mine, but he's not using it because it's so old. Nobody would want to use it. I mean, it's a '76 Beetle.
But you can drive it.
It's incredibly reliable. Yeah, I can drive it.
Oh, that's great.
If you want to drive on Syrian roads, I mean, they are insane.
Well,
it was
I
quite
can see how that would give you a little bit
in Iran.
Yeah, almost.
We don't wear seatbelts in Syria. Like, I don't know, just no one bothers really. But in Iran, everyone was like, "Buckle up, put your seatbelt on." I was like, "Oh God, it's like being back in Europe."
In Jordan, they always say the taxi drivers, when I get into, I think it was also in Egypt, I had someone say this. Like, I would look for a seatbelt to put it on, and they would be like, "No, that's don't do that. God will protect you. That's offensive towards God. Like, don't offend God like that, because you don't need that. He'll protect you." Like, all right, that's a
well,
bit
I have a bad experience. I have a bad experience of not wearing it, so now I'm pretty obsessed.
6 months in a double arm cast, right? That sounds like a good warning.
Almost 2 months, and then yeah.
So people buckle up. Well, I was going to say, on your Instagram, you have some beautiful horses there too. So do you also have horses as well as dogs?
I did when I first came here, because basically he was a rescue Syrian Arabian racehorse that they had broken, basically, and then they didn't want him anymore. So I bought him for next to nothing. He was a stallion. He was beautiful. I think he might be on my Instagram. I'm not sure.
Black stallion.
There's a black one, but he was grey. He was dapple grey. And I loved him. And we fixed him. Basically, we found a really good farrier, fixed his foot, fixed his tendon, and he was amazing. He was just my little war horse, really. And because near here there's a big racetrack, and that's where I kept him, so I could go and literally ride on the racetrack every day, the sand track.
Oh, that's nice.
There. And the funniest thing is, the sand track is in the middle of the air base, of the air defense base. So you're literally, I'm riding on the racetrack, and then all around me is Syrian air defense, which is about 5 kilometers from where I'm living. And Israel actually bombed there one day when I was walking the dogs at about 11 in the morning.
Oh, no.
And I was, I don't know, like 200 meters away from the first impact of the missile. And the amazing thing was, there were a ton of officials and horse owners and so on having this big meeting in the stands. And they didn't see the explosion behind them. I saw them, and then behind the stand, I saw the missile hit, and this molten shrapnel just everywhere. And they just heard the noise. They didn't see it. But I didn't have my phone with me. I couldn't film it because it's a relatively secure area, so I don't usually take my phone, and I don't take photos there. But that was one of the dogs. Actually is completely traumatized. She won't go outside now because she's convinced if she puts her head out the door, Israel's going to bomb. So
How long ago was that? How long has she been living with that?
It's must be about 18 months now. But for example, she's my early warning system, because if the Israeli missiles, because they tend to come overhead here before they hit the target in Damascus, she hears it before me, because she freaks out and goes to the top room in the house. So she wakes me up, and then I'll hear the missile incoming. So she hears it before any of us do. Bless her.
Oh, that's really that's amazing, but also it's really sad that she's so traumatized.
She's
what happened to your horse then?
Well, things started to get really expensive here, like the impact of sanctions and the US stealing not only oil but all the wheat and barley and so on. So all the horse food was getting extortionately expensive. So he went to a friend of mine that breeds horses, and he's in a really good place now. He's in a really nice stable, and the kids are riding him every day, because I sort of trained him up quite nicely as well. So I do miss him, but it was also a lot of time. They are a kind of time theft.
Sure, he's in that environment. Well, that's cool. Yeah, well, that sounds like good therapy. Like, hanging out,
Yeah.
hanging out with dogs and
True.
horses.
Especially,
How many dogs do you have?
horses.
6.
Wow. Oh, you're like a regular
Wow.
Glenn Greenwald.
All
Oh my
of them
God.
rescued except
Hey, you are
one.
Glenn Greenwald. You got to partner up with him. You could start a franchise. In the.
Why? Has he got dogs?
You know, he does that, right? He has a big dog rescue in Brazil.
Oh no, I didn't know that. No, I didn't.
You didn't know that? Oh, you gotta look that up. Just type in
Who are you
Glenn
talking?
Greenwald. Glenn Greenwald
Green-
dog rescue. There's a whole documentary where this guy filmed his.
Oh, really?
He uses He employs homeless people to be the workers at his dog rescue, and so he helps to.
Okay.
Helps
Cool.
the street dogs and it's really, really sweet. And he started it because of just like you. He like started rescuing all these dogs and had like a house full of dogs, and then he was like, well, I guess I got to turn it into something bigger. And so he
Yeah, I mean, I've stopped at the house full of dogs because they're just. I was speaking to a local trainer today. Actually, he's going to take the young one because she's a real handful. So he's going to take her because I've got to go to Aleppo. I've got to, I've got a lot of work on in the next few weeks. And she's a bit of a handful for anyone that comes and looks after them when I'm away. So I decided, no, she's going to go off for intense training.
Oh, that's good. That'll be
While I'm
good for
away.
Yeah.
Dogs like it when
She's
they're training.
amazing. I mean, she was a rescue. She came from Lebanon. She'd been dumped, and then she got pneumonia, and people were throwing stones at her, and so on. So I was like, it's not a great region for animal care here.
Sarah's starting a cat rescue, so she has the start of a cat orphanage also. So.
Yeah, the cats are amazing in Iran. They're enormous. I guess they come from the Shiraz breed, the Persian breed originally, but all the street cats are massive. I was really like laughing. Our Syrian street cats are like Greek and Egyptian street cats. They're all got the like pointy noses and they're all really skinny and white.
Right.
But in Iran, they're huge.
Yes.
Wow, that's interesting. I didn't even notice that before. I have to keep an eye on the size differences.
Yeah.
I know that there's a lot of street cats in Turkey I saw, and there's a ton in Cairo.
Yeah.
And I think now that you mentioned it, the ones in Cairo do tend to be really kind of slender, smaller cats. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I call them
But
Anubis
the one
cats.
in Turkey are very small.
Yeah. I guess that's the Middle Eastern type, whereas the Persian type is the bigger, hairier, chunkier cats that then became so popular in the West, of course. But the street cats have obviously inherited that size and that bulk because they were all beautiful. I was like, oh, I want to take them home.
Very cute.
Setareh started posting a lot of cat shorts on our YouTube channel, so I hope that trend continues because I think that's a great way to I don't know.
Yeah, the cats of Iran. I want people to see cats of Iran.
Connection to nature is what keeps me sane, actually, probably. Whether it's dogs, cats, trees, green, mountains, anything that reminds us that we're all part of this planet, actually, rather than constantly being divided and segregated and told what we should think about each other.
It's the same for me. I keep bees and I keep a lot of little animals. So that's
amazing. Yeah.
Bees are really fascinating.
Yeah.
Always keep you on your toes.
I can imagine. Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. Anyway, guys, I better go because my fire's about to go out and I need to put some water on. Now the electric's gone off.
So that's your version of
places in Iran are so hot. Like seriously, you keep your houses and your hotels like green
she told me that. I didn't. Oh wow, more data points there.
I was so happy to get.
I personally can't stand it because that's not the way we do in our nobody. I'm probably the only one or the one that likes heat more than others, and it's Like my bedroom is too cold for my friends that come over. They think it's like just too cold. Yeah, because I don't like it too hot.
It was amazing. It was just, bearing in mind I came from a country that has no heating to every room. I mean, literally, I was getting people to open windows. like I'm dying. It's like a greenhouse.
Wow.
Exactly. That's what I did when I went to university. I was always opening the windows. Even at the dorm, I was always opening the windows during the winter time because it was like too hot.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a problem we have here. Yeah.
Freezing cold outside and boiling hot inside.
Good luck getting your
That's
fire
not
going.
healthy. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you.
And
thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.
I'd love to follow your reporting on Aleppo. I know that's going to be a really traumatic experience to go there and have to hash that out again. But it's great that you're going there and that you're providing an independent journalistic viewpoint on that. So I'll look forward from you on that and reading your work. So I encourage everyone to follow that.
Thank you for your great work.
Thanks, guys. Thank you. And thank you for yours. Keep doing it.
Thank you, everyone, for watching another episode of Child Told Tales podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.